Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for day 2 of Brave New Worlds, Who Decides? Research, Risk, and Responsibility. For those of you who just joined us today, I'm Luis Campos. I'm the Baker College Chair of the History of Science, Technology, and Innovation here at Rice University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Yesterday, we heard something about exploring the nearly infinite potential design space of biology and equally near infinite complexities of navigating questions of relations, of governance, of the industriousness and the demands of industry, and the responsibility to think of ourselves as future ancestors. And we even heard about, at the very end of one of the talks, glow-in-the-dark petunias that might soon be found on the streets of Boston. And I just wanted to mention that one of the speakers we had invited who was unable to join us, in fact, was Klaus Pichler, who had come to campus last spring, who has a project called the Petunia Carnage. He's a photographer, and he documented when it was discovered that there were transgenic petunias growing outside of a train station in Finland that was in violation of EU regulations. And so all of these petunias had to be found and then destroyed under EU regulations. So it's very interesting to think about how differently those futures might look in different parts of the world and in different places, and petunias in particular seems to be one of these touchstones for us. So sometimes these innovations we talk about feel new. They sometimes also, especially for those of us inclined towards the historical, they feel familiar. And this question of how academic and industrial interests in biological innovation had related to these exciting new prospects for discovery was something that we explored in some depth yesterday. We also explored this over time. We considered in some detail questions about memory and myth and history, and stories and dynamics at play of investment, of profit, of international relations, and sometimes things that are not always visible on the surface. We also remembered to embody and explore some of these questions not only with our minds, but thinking about ourselves as embodied beings, right? That we practice certain forms of movement, or, as happened last night, we imbibed the spirit of Asilomar with some truly delightful brave new hors d'oeuvres, courtesy of the executive chefs of 5 different serveries here from Rice Dining. This was a real treat. So I want to express my gratitude to Chef Johnny for making that possible. So in this conference, we've also explored a little bit of the question of utopias and dystopias. And this began even with Professor Endersby's opening remarks at our launch a few weeks ago. Again, that video is available online if you'd like to review that. And Professor Endersby had said that utopia is also primarily a literary genre, which invites its readers to imagine alternatives to the existing world. I think that's also something we were able to explore yesterday morning, something that Michael Rogers had reminded us about again. I had offered some reflections from Benjamin Franklin, from H.G. Wells, and as H.G. Wells had titled his book, these considerations about the way that the world is going. And we began to realize the familiarity of these issues. He was concerned about the future of motor cars overtaking the world, and were we ready for this collapsing of distance, right? And we are now all familiar with some of those consequences, but to think about what it means to live on these edges of unknown futures is, I think, the issue for us. As the scholar Peter Bowler once noted, Wells had realized that this state of uncertainty would continue indefinitely, making it virtually impossible, he said, even for the enthusiasts to predict what would emerge. The technophiles, Bowler says, hail their innovations as the driving force of progress, but they don't always foresee what will be invented or what the ultimate effects on society will be. This is a situation, he said, we are acutely aware of today. Few, if any, could have anticipated the impact of computers and the digital revolution, and we're only gradually becoming aware that these innovations have not brought us unalloyed benefits, he said. The range of technologies that have turned out to have harmful side effects is now legion, a situation that Wells himself anticipated, unquote. So who decides is an important question across many realms of innovation, and just as importantly, maybe the question, who decides who decides? And how do we balance these valuable ideas of precaution and restraint on heedless careening towards exciting futures with the endless proliferation of what-if scenarios that might unnecessarily dampen futures that we want? We can, after all, always generate another what-if scenario either by ignorance or by the exaggeration of risk, such that perfect bureaucratic entanglements can become the enemy of the good. Last summer, Scientific American noted that, quote, politics has a way of turning well-intentioned recommendations from scientists into bureaucratic nightmares, which can hobble scientific progress while bringing about no appreciable benefits. But of course, politics is also essential. It's at the very heart of this question of who decides. And the public realm of discussion of these issues seems to be increasingly important, something that we also talked about and thought about yesterday. We began to hear these fascinating accounts of the intersections of machine learning techniques with biological innovation, and something that we'll expand on in a notion further today as we turn to topics of data and surveillance. While the science fiction writer Jack Williamson, who had coined the term genetic engineering and terraforming back in the 1920s and 30s, once wrote a science fiction future where all labor is automated and humans have nothing left to do than to sit with, as the title of his story was, with folded hands. So that was the name of a rather terrifying short story about labor-saving robots. But just a year ago, the New York Times technology columnist had written a disturbing op-ed about how he had what he called a, quote, disturbing 2-hour conversation with Bing's new AI chatbot that led Sydney into declaring its love for him and tried to destroy his marriage. Quote, this is exactly the sort of conversation we need to be having, and I'm glad it's happening out in the open. These are things that would be impossible to discover in the lab. So this is sometimes the framework of how these things get talked about in the public realm. I think there are many deeper and other kinds of analyses that we can do, and we're very lucky today to have many scholars to help us think about that. And in our first panel, we'll be turning towards these issues of data and surveillance and these brave new worlds that even the most visionary science fiction thinkers may not have been able to think about. So to help introduce this morning's panel, I'd like to welcome to the stage Michael Rogers, who's been closely following these issues about AI, the uses of data, and surveillance for some time now to help introduce the morning's speakers.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to see so many bright shining faces here on a Saturday morning, and not even a sunny one. Today's panel should be quite interesting. It made me think, data and surveillance, about a disturbing conversation I had 5 or 6 years ago. I was working with a group of digital marketers and talking about my belief that the private sector is really not capable of self-regulation when it comes to data privacy and its proper usage. And I was getting a lot of pushback from the digital marketers, and that maybe the conversation got a little bit heated, and finally one of the younger ones blurted out, "Michael, we already have far more information about you than we can ever hope to use." And I'm not quite sure if he thought that would end the discussion, but it was not reassuring. However, fast forward 5 or 6 years to today, and now we have AI, which potentiates. Deep learning potentiates the possibility of using surveillance data in many, many more ways, and connecting points of data that we would not have even thought of connecting or been able to. I mean, because one of the keys of machine learning and cognitive computing is the ability to see patterns that are not at all clear to humans. So, the flip side of that is that this kind of use of AI on large pieces of data is also beneficial. I'll do 2 quick examples. One is healthcare. I mean, healthcare monitoring, the idea of digital doubles where patient information is anonymized but exists in the cloud and can be compared with other patients. Data sharing is going to be very, very important at some point. Right now, the NIH is working on it started off on the wrong foot, but it's a very deep data dive into long COVID. Long COVID being an illness that is multi-symptom, that is somewhat vague sometimes in presentation, and affects more women than men. And this is the exact category of disease that has traditionally not been researched properly. So that's just one example of where big data and analytics will work. A second, actually, that occurred to me, because I'm heading to talk about the electrical grid next week, is that energy conservation, the smart city, the ability to tie together all kinds of sensor data to make the use of energy much more efficient. I mean, when we started electric cars, home batteries, solar panels. We're really going to have a lot of data coming back in to manage that. And, it sounds like sort of a harmless thing, but for those of us who grew up in the American era of cannabis prohibition, many of you may recall that, at least for a brief period of time, there was a popular police tactic of finding grow houses because of their excessive electrical usage. And you just went to the power company and you could just pick them right out. This is a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs that's using as much power as our entire downtown. Anyway, so it's a perfect example here of benefits and risks. And I'm going to learn that there's a ledge here. So to start off, actually along those lines of healthcare, sort of perfect timing, we have Lauren Stadler, who's an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering here at Rice. She has a BS in engineering from Swarthmore, MSc and PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Michigan. Now, her research has focused on wastewater-based epidemiology, environmental antibiotic resistance, wastewater and resource recovery, and environmental synthetic biology. So this is a perfect example, I think, of data surveillance in the healthcare field, and I look forward to hearing her thoughts. Lauren.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak here, and to the conference organizers for putting together such a wonderful event. So my name is Lauren Stadler. I'm an assistant professor of civil environmental engineering. Today I'm going to talk to you about wastewater surveillance. So how many people have heard of wastewater surveillance? Yes, okay. How many people have actually looked at a dashboard and looked at the wastewater data? Okay. Still a pretty good number here, which is awesome. And how many people have gone to the bathroom this morning? Okay. Thank you for contributing to our sample. All right, how do I advance here? Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, what is wastewater surveillance, right? So a large portion of infected people, when you're infected with a pathogen, you shed that pathogen, often in your stool or your urine. But even if you don't shed it there, you go take a shower, and if it's an infection on your skin, it gets washed and goes down the drain, or you cough and you spit in the sink. And this all ends up going down the drain into our sewer systems. And so wastewater, when we collect this sample, represents a pooled sample of all the individuals that contributed to that waste stream. And so we can look at that sample and we can detect and look for, and quantify pathogens in it, and that can tell us something about infections in the community. And we can do this at different scales, right? So we can do it at, for example, the most downstream point, which is the wastewater treatment plant. This is where all the sewage flows before it's treated, and that can capture, thousands to millions of people, depending on where you are. But you can also move up the sewer system and go and identify a manhole that's directly outside a building or facility, like a hospital or a school, and you can collect a sample that only represents the wastewater from that facility. And there's some huge advantages of this as an approach for public health surveillance, right? It is resource efficient, right? We have this pooled sample from the whole community. The default is opt-in, right? You don't have to do anything different every day. You just go to the bathroom and you're contributing to the sample. And that means that unlike clinical testing, it does not depend on individual testing and reporting, and it does not depend on health-seeking habits or access to healthcare resources. It is de-identified. I will say question mark. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's de-identified in that when I quantify or detect a pathogen in that sample, I don't know who contributed that pathogen. I just know that it was there and it came from someone who contributed to that wastewater sample. For many pathogens, and many infections, you can shed that pathogen whether you're symptomatic or asymptomatic. And that, again, allows you to pick up infections in a community in a much wider way than clinical testing does, because usually you only go get tested when you're feeling symptomatic or you've been hospitalized already. And it's quite comprehensive, at least in places like the United States. So in the US, about 80% of US households are served by a municipal wastewater collection system. So we capture a large portion of the population just by focusing on infrastructure and sampling from infrastructure that already exists. Of course, you have to keep in mind that, just because you don't detect it in the wastewater, it doesn't mean that it's not there. So it's not as sensitive as, for example, an individual test would be. And so because of these advantages, it's really exploded globally. This is one of my favorite I guess it's an aggregator of dashboards. It's called COVID Poops 19. And it aggregates all of the wastewater surveillance that's going on across the globe that's been reported publicly. And there's 195 public-facing dashboards where you can go and look at wastewater data that's being measured. There's 4,000, over 4,600 sites that are actively or I think this is active sites that are producing wastewater surveillance data across 72 countries. So if we think about, pandemic preparedness, this infrastructure, has all largely been stood up because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it makes us it should, in theory, make us much more prepared for a future pandemic. Because if some new pathogen were to emerge, we could quickly activate this network of surveillance sites across the globe and hopefully really understand, transmission and introductions into communities before, clinical cases are presenting at high numbers. So in the US, this system is funded and run largely by the CDC through their National Wastewater Surveillance System. There's about a little over 1,300 sites across the US. And they now use it as their primary source of information on, for example, COVID-19. So if you're hearing CDC messaging, it's largely based on the wastewater levels that are measured from this network of the National Wastewater Surveillance System. And Houston has been actively involved in this, and we were named a Center of Excellence for this National Wastewater Surveillance System to help support innovation and implementation of wastewater surveillance across the country. And that's because, and I'll kind of shift to talking about what we've done here, we have one of the most advanced citywide monitoring systems in the country, if not the world. We have about 120 sites that we monitor weekly across the city. And these include wastewater treatment plants, so these are kind of covering the 2.3 million people that live and are served by our public infrastructure for wastewater treatment. Those are shown in these different colored areas on this map. Some of these serve over 500,000 people, and some serve less than 1,000 people. We also monitor at lift stations. So these are basically sub-sewer shed locations that allow us to break up these really big sewer sheds into smaller geographic and population areas. But the majority of our sites are actually facility level. So we have about 50 schools that we monitor their wastewater. We also collect samples from, from nursing homes, homeless shelters, and the jail. And I'll talk about kind of how this information is used. I'm not really going to talk that much about the science. I'll just, as a really brief overview, these samples are collected weekly. They are transported to the lab where we detect, quantify, and in some cases sequence the pathogens out of those samples to understand circulating variants. That data goes into a model that is used to identify areas of the city and trends in pathogen levels in different areas of the city. It's summarized into a report, and that report goes to the health department, who then communicates that out both to the public and to healthcare officials across the city, and then uses it for public health action. And those actions have really evolved. This whole system was stood up for SARS-CoV-2, so much of this was focused on testing resources, mobile testing units being directed to neighborhoods that really had high levels or sharp increases. And now it's really shifted to vaccination clinics, and so using this information to direct resources and improve vaccination rates in communities. And it works really well. Hopefully, I'm not trying to convince you in this presentation that it works really well, but it really does work well. Our group and many other groups have now shown this. So SARS-CoV-2, it really tracks cases. We have so much data on cases, so it's our rich data set to kind of show it really works well for SARS-CoV-2. It leads hospitalizations by 1 to 2 weeks. So, the TMC will look at this data very closely to kind of understand not only hospital admissions, but staffing. So, how much of their staff is expected to call in sick in the next few weeks. It also works for other respiratory viruses like influenza and RSV, and it works for emerging really low prevalence viruses like Mpox. And so we've used it in all these cases. I'll give an example for Mpox. We hadn't had any reported cases of Mpox in Houston for months. And then at the end of 2023, we had a detection in the wastewater at a Sentinel site, and no cases had been reported. And we worked closely with the health department to use this to kind of trigger more wider sampling and analysis of the wastewater to see if this is something that's widespread across the city. And we did have another positive detection in a specific neighborhood. And then lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, there was a case reported in that neighborhood. And this gave the health department extra time to get organized and mobilize resources and hold a vaccination event in that sewer shed area where both the case and the wastewater were positive based on these results. So it really did function as this early warning system, even for this very low prevalence disease. So at a citywide level, that's an example of how it's used. But as I mentioned before, we do a lot of facility level monitoring. And so we have a pretty mature now school monitoring program, about 50 schools located across Houston in these 3 clusters shown on the map. And these have been involved since December 2020. And we're actively monitoring at these schools for respiratory viruses, so SARS-CoV-2, influenza, and RSV. These results are reported back to the schools every week, to the school nurses, and even to the parents. And we've expanded to start looking for vaccine-preventable diseases like measles, mumps, and rubella, especially as we're concerned that vaccination rates are dropping in some areas of the country and some communities. And this has been, we were very worried about this. One, would it work? Do kids actually go to the bathroom at school? I wasn't sure if we're going to actually get signals. And it turns out, again, it works very well. It both reflects cases in the school, but it also reflects community rates of infection. So you can actually use the schools as kind of sentinel or representative sites for the entire community that schools are located in. And we can think about this in the future as maybe we can use this to understand transmission. A lot of people worry that schools are sources of transmission within communities. With wastewater surveillance, you can start to look at where do we see peaks or increases in these levels first. And is there any evidence here that schools are a place of transmission for different diseases? And the health department has really used this to serve as a springboard into the community to encourage vaccinations. So now we have, I think, the first of its kind text message program. So as a parent, you can subscribe, and if you have a positive detection, you can get a text message push alert that says the school's wastewater was positive for influenza this week. Here is a vaccine. Here's what you can do with that information. Here are some options if you want to get vaccinated. Here are some options you can do to protect yourself if you have immunocompromised people at home. And we're trying to use this as a way to build public interest, public trust, and also empower people with this information. And now, actually, if we have 2 positive detections in a row at a school, the health department hosts a vaccine clinic at that school and says, we're having free vaccines here. And kind of one of the benefits has been that some parents are like, oh, I'm getting my kid vaccinated for influenza. Let's get them caught up on all the vaccines. So we've actually seen some additional improvements in vaccinations just from offering these in a targeted way. Okay, so that's kind of how it exists today. And if we think about the future of wastewater surveillance, I think it is here to stay. It's really been proven as an effective public health surveillance tool. I think it's going to be mined for much, much more information, not just pathogens, which I list a bunch on this slide, but also for other things that can tell us something about community behavior and health. And this stuff has already been done largely some of it just in the research world, but also in practice. So things like looking for illicit drugs or pharmaceutical use. You can look at the wastewater and get a sense of, opioid usage in communities and tobacco usage and even dietary markers. And so increasingly, I think, as technologies make this, faster, more real-time, cheaper, more sensitive, and even smarter, I think we're gonna see wastewater become kind of a more important resource for understanding community health and behavior. I mean, I'm also part of a project that's focused on how do we build kind of these more real-time sensors that would live in our sewers potentially, and maybe even be smart, like talk to each other. Oh, I saw this virus. Let me tell my neighbor biosensors to also start looking for it. And having almost like a smart connected system, right, where we can, like I say, this is a rich source of microbes and other things that tell us about community health that have help. So you could think about this, learning from patterns of different things that you observe in the wastewater to really link that to decisions that you'd make about behavior. And I also want to mention that this field has gained a lot of interest from private companies. I think since 2020, over 50 private companies have entered this space of wastewater surveillance. One was Ginkgo Bioworks, who spoke yesterday, but there's many others who offer it, and many other life science companies that are also getting involved. And I think that's important because some of these companies are very open and they're working very closely with CDC, but I think also there's a little bit more black boxness to some of these monitoring systems that are being put forth. Okay, so I think I'll spend the rest of my talk really just touching, and again, I'm not a wastewater surveillance ethics person, but we do think about these challenges a lot related to privacy and ethical considerations. And that's because while many people have heard of wastewater surveillance, I think the actual process of what we're doing and how it's done is not always very well understood. This work is often done, funded and implemented by the government. It includes monitoring of marginalized populations. Wastewater does contain human genetic information, right? We are not looking at that, but in theory, right, you could sequence that human genetic information, and this whole question of de-identification kind of comes to bear. It requires, as all public health surveillance does, making decisions under resource constraints, right? We're often making a decision between two paths that are imperfect. And then, of course, there's connection bias. I think it is less biased than maybe clinical surveillance, but you're still largely only capturing people who are connected to the sewer system. So people who live in rural areas are really not going to be even captured by this type of surveillance. And so a lot of academics and practitioners have started to think about ethical frameworks that we might have for wastewater surveillance. And this usually begins with articulating some of the communication challenges and ethical risks of wastewater surveillance, and then putting forth some guidance about how you might think about these things. And so we've done a lot of this, thinking through it with our system. These are just a few different areas that are often brought up, publicly communicating findings, issues of consent. And I thought I'd just give a few examples from the Houston situation as kind of concrete ways that we've thought about some of these challenges and ethical dilemmas. So one of the big challenges that we're constantly kind of grappling with is how to publicly communicate findings. So when I guess I'm not really doing this measurement, when my group does these measurements in the lab, we think about it as a concentration where we measure copies of a viral RNA in a liter of wastewater. But that doesn't mean anything to anyone, right? Nobody thinks about viral concentrations. And so how do we communicate levels of this virus in a way that's understandable and useful to the public, and also as those levels and their meaning changes over time? And then how do we also get this data out in a way that the public can see it, use it? And so we've really focused on trying to create this dashboard, right? And many other groups have done this as well, so that people can see our results as we're generating them. They can actually search by their address because nobody knows which sewer shed they belong to, right? And so they can look at these results as we're generating them. And that's also the effort of the text message program. And then we, instead of presenting things as copies per liter of wastewater, we present it as a benchmark level. So we basically benchmarked it to the level when our first peak in Houston was. And we present everything as a relative percentage to that. And I don't know if that was the best solution, but it was the solution we came up here. Again, trying to make these results more understandable to the public. The other challenge that we're constantly facing is how to communicate uncertainty and limitations of this data. Wastewater is extremely variable. Variable for many reasons, some of which we don't fully understand yet, like what happens to these pathogens as they're traveling through the sewer before I get that sample. How much variability is there in shedding between different infected individuals? I think there's a ton of outstanding research questions. But in the end, what we get is a measurement, right? And it's highly variable, and we're trying to communicate that variability and that limitation. So just a really easy example is here I'm showing our school wastewater monitoring results in this heat map. So the schools are on the y-axis and just dates are on the and on the x-axis. And you can see we have a positive result, so yes, we detected the virus. A negative result, no, we did not. And then the inconclusive, very unsatisfying yellow square, which, what does that mean? It usually means that it was positive in one of our replicates and negative in the other one, and which usually means it was right around the detection limit. But it's a very unsatisfying, what does that mean to me? Is this a meaningful way? And is this the best way to do this? Maybe not, but this is the way we chose to do it. And so even with the quantitative measurements, there's a huge amount of variability. So if we're trying to trend levels over time, and it's hard to tell, is this really increasing given these humongous error bars that we're seeing? And so, but I feel like most people don't really look at the error bars, right? So they look at just, does it look like it's increasing over time? So this is a challenge that we're constantly trying to deal with, and communicating uncertainty about this, and maybe even revising it. It seems like it's going up, but the next week, it's actually just plateaued, is something that we're constantly challenged with. We also worry a lot about the false positive and the false negative. So the false positive is, okay, our test says it's there, but there's actually no cases there. And there's a lot of really negative repercussions that could happen. For example, if you're looking for a very rare disease marker. So I think about measles all the time. Everyone's really worried about measles. There's huge measles outbreaks all across the world. It's vaccine preventable, but vaccination rates are going down. If I detect measles in a school and it triggers a huge response, and we don't see any cases, we lose trust immediately, right? People will not trust the system moving forward. And the flip is also true. If we're constantly getting false negatives, we're not able to sensitively pick up these targets in the wastewater, then what's the value of this, right? Are we adding value to public health surveillance if our level of detection is so high that we can't even pick up infections in a community? Okay, and then kind of the last thing I'll mention is issues of consent and also kind of potential for stigmatization of populations. In public health surveillance, and wastewater surveillance is just a form of public health surveillance, I kind of look to kind of other ethical frameworks that exist. And this is from the WHO's guidelines on ethical issues in public health surveillance, where it says, individuals have an obligation to contribute to surveillance when reliable, valid, complete data sets are required and relevant protection is in place. Under these circumstances, informed consent is not ethically required. And in the case of wastewater surveillance, it's also impractical, right? We're monitoring millions of people with a few samples. It is not feasible to get consent for this type of surveillance. But we also, choose where we collect that sample, right? We can move upstream, like I said. You can go to the facility level. Are there situations where informed consent does become a requirement? When I go to the monitoring of a household, which we're not doing, but I'm saying, if you were to go to the scale of a household, how would this change? But there's also this balancing act of, privacy and actionability. When you monitor at the citywide level and you get levels, you kind of get a temperature for infectious disease in your community. But when you monitor at a facility like a school, that information becomes a lot more actionable, for example, for the health department to know exactly where to direct resources. And so there's this trade-off between kind of privacy and actionability that exists in the scale in which we monitor. And so I'll just say that this has been a super fun project to be part of, and the way we've kind of tried to deal with some of these issues is we've leaned on a panel of experts. So we formed a wastewater advisory committee that's made up of public health officials, infectious disease doctors, and epidemiologists. And the goal here is really to use them as to help us prioritize what to look for, where to look for it, how to communicate our results, and what actionable information can be taken from some of the stuff that we're getting from the wastewater. We've also done a lot of what-if scenarios, so I appreciate that in the introduction this morning. You know, we have a lot of, and this is not important that you can read this, a lot of conversations about, especially as new technologies come on, things that become much more targeted. You're not looking for a specific disease target, you're sequencing everything. Okay, now what happens when you discover something new or scary in a school sample, in a citywide sample? Well, who gets notified? What are the follow-up actions that are taken? Is this information made public or private? Why or why not? And who makes those decisions? And so, don't have great, maybe we can discuss this, don't have great answers, but we do think about a lot of these things and under different kind of scenario building. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing with the panel.
Thank you. Very thoughtful look and perfect example of the kinds of issues we need to think about. There are always interesting ways to redefine what we're doing, and in a sense, I believe that's what Matthew Jones will be talking about today. He is the Smith Family Professor of History at Princeton. In 2023, just last year, Norton published his How Data Happened, A History from the Age of Reason to the Age of Algorithms, which has been really well reviewed and is on my next to read list. He's completing a book with a great title, Great Exploitations on State Surveillance of Communications and Information Warfare. And he's got two previous books, Reckoning with Matter, Calculating Machines, Innovation and Thinking About Thinking, from Pascal to Babbage, and The Good Life in the Scientific Revolution, Descartes, Pascal, Leibniz, and the Cultivation of Virtue. Great title, too. Okay, Matthew, please.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for the generous introduction, and to the organizing committee and those that provide the infrastructure allow us to speak. And it's a particular honor to be on this panel with Lauren, Lily, and Sergio because of the concreteness of so much of the work they do. And I hope this is in dialogue. Okay, this didn't translate super well, but we'll survive. I actually changed my title from one bit of arcana to a different bit of arcana. Why did I do this? Because something ripped from the headlines. 2 weeks ago, the New York Times ran an article that the NSA buys American internet data without warrants. And it was a classic piece of muckraking journalism of the kind that since the early 1970s, the New York Times and the Washington Post have occasionally done. Now, it was based on a letter that NSA had written to a senator, Senator Ron Wyden, who has long been a sort of a fly in the ointment to try to get NSA, FBI, and CIA to explain some of the decision-making they do, because after all, he's a senator and ought to be involved in these processes. So if Lily is talking about granular governance and the group of coalitions, today I'm going to be talking about the exclusion of the vast amount of people, even at the highest reaches of government, in making decision-making. So, what did the letter say? So today, my talk is going to be almost entirely incredibly boring, arcane text. The text of everyday governance, and it matters. So I'm going to give you lots of text. Well, what the letter said is, dear Senator Wyden, yes, you're right, we do purchase lots of data about telecommunications of people all around the world, including Americans. The NSA acquires various types of data for foreign intelligence, cybersecurity, and other authorized mission purposes. That's your huge loophole. This includes information associated with electronic devices being used, and in certain cases, inside the United States. This is kind of big news. Now, this is both used for domestic and foreign. And it's not a big deal, they say. Why is it not a big deal? I am not aware of any requirement in US law or regulation that says that DoD can't buy the same data that our foreign adversaries can buy. In other words, because the commercial telecommunications industry and other sorts of things have collected all of this data, and it is for sale for people who want to sell ads or examine you or do anything else, it's no problem for NSA to purchase this kind of data. Now, what I want to talk about today is that we need histories of how it is that there was a conjunction of things that made this possible. On the one hand, the conjunction that in the United States, there is, except in small sectors, extremely low levels of privacy protection for most commercial data. This is unlike particularly Europe, and is different in certain kinds of states. And secondly, there is a development which says that if you're thinking about Fourth Amendment search and seizure law, when it's legitimate to collect things on US persons, people in the United States, which is more than just citizens, that no longer applies when you're dealing with data from a third party. So NSA has essentially hacked the system. It's commercially available, and it's no problem if you buy from something commercially available. Now, this is all part of a long story that some of you may have followed that involves Snowden but preceded Snowden, about the quest for what is called metadata. So since the sort of a few years after 9/11, we've had story after story of how it is that the NSA and DEA and others have sought metadata. That is, it's a data about our calling without the content of it, is generally how it's defined. And these latest letters are part of an ongoing quest to retain this data and legal authorities to produce it. Now, what exactly is metadata? Well, just to give you a sense of the nature of the conversation, we do not know. In fact, this is from a top secret court case by the one court that is allowed to talk about this. So when they say metadata, they say it's just like your telephone number. It's just the telephone number you're dialing without the content. Unless they're using the world's largest font, it's not that. It's something else, and exactly what it is not so clear. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to tell you this whole history, and I promise you the documents I'm going to show you are stultifyingly boring, but that matters, because that is the nature of this kind of elite governance. It is precisely not involving stakeholders in community. It's not even involving people in government that should be involved, as Senator Wyden thinks, but many other sorts of, and it makes us weaker, whether in national security terms, in terms of a collective sort of thing. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of a genealogy, one of the genealogies of how this occasioned. And part of the story here is that it's not just 9/11. 9/11 took the form it took, much like in Lily's talk. The kind of things that happened were preconditioned. But I want to talk a little bit about some of those preconditions. And the Baker Institute's exactly the right place to do it, because it was during the Reagan and Bush administration, at the highest reaches of government, that some major transformations in the very categorization of foreign versus domestic came about. Okay. So in the illustrated monthly circulated only to NSA employees called Cryptolog, I highly recommend it, it's a good, amusing read. In 1986, they had an article called Something New Targeting Narcotics Traffickers, and you see the thing crossed out there. This is a very secret document. It's a high level of sort of thing. And what it said is that the NSA was going to be given a new job. This is the middle of the Reagan administration. And that job involved tracking narcotics, both in foreign places, but also domestically, and particularly transnationally. We academics are very happy with the category of transnational. Transnational is a legal category that was used first, really to legitimate certain kinds of practices. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but note that I have in italics the word reasonable expectation of privacy. We'll come back to this, but the argument was that narcotic traffickers do not have this reasonable expectation of privacy. And therefore, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply. Now, the background of this is actually the same moment as Asilomar, which is that in the sort of Watergate and immediate post-Watergate era, we have, as all of us know, this intersection of a new oppositional journalism, the experience of Watergate, the experience of Vietnam, and a series of profound legislative proposals. In the case of intelligence, there's a so-called year of intelligence in which the naughty deeds, particularly of the CIA, including assassinations and the surveillance of civil liberties community and things at the NSA, all comes to the public. It is a low moment for the intelligence community, and they see themselves as almost not having survived it. They barely stave off massive congressional legislation, and instead, through very skillful legal maneuvering, they are really, truly, and many people don't believe this, but they really are far more directed on the foreign threat, and many of their domestic things are removed, and it becomes part of the spirit of the kind of thing. But there's a real sense they barely survive this. And one of the facets of this is that the secret court, the FISA court, is stood up. And that is the one court that's allowed to have information about this. That court, however, has no one from the civil liberties world by design until quite recently. So when drugs are added to their portfolio, 10 years later, it says something about what had happened in the 70s, how that moment was operationalized, how it was transformed. One more thing about the 70s. In 1974, there is a bipartisan bill to provide privacy and rights of data. That bill, through corporate lobbying, becomes stripped down to only be about the federal government. So the United States almost had the most robust privacy legislation in the world for commercial data in 1974, but the business lobby said all of your concerns are speculative, we can always pass legislation later. Today, the very companies that say Lily is talking about treat that commercial availability of data as a natural thing, and it was far from that. And the way in which the anti-government spirit of the early 70s becomes operationalized as a kind of libertarianism is, I think, something that is underlying half of what we're talking about in this conference. Okay, so I'm just going to run quickly through what happened. So in the middle of the 80s, the vice president's office, President Bush, becomes upset that the intelligence community isn't playing ball on narcotics and terrorism. And so what they do is a kind of shift that it's just so arcane, but it's crucial for the world in which we live. So in a thing called a National Security Decision Directive, and you can see it was secret until quite recently, changes what narcotics is. Narcotics and terrorism had been law enforcement issues, not something that the military and intelligence were supposed to mess with. They get redefined fundamentally as threats to the national security of the United States. They enter a new legal category. This is a legal category that matters largely only in secret documents like this. So it says that many of these documents, which were set up to defend Americans against domestic surveillance, need to be interpreted in a different way because these are national security threats. So so what happens is that thus the detection and neutralization of illegal drugs and terrorist devices, and here's some nice blimps, one of them says, just say no, you 80s kids will remember this, and the Coast Guard becomes very involved in intelligence. It becomes almost naturalized, a new form of the acceptance of using our intelligence capacities to spy on people in the United States as others. And in particular, that things that we would now call metadata, but didn't have that name yet, were legitimate objects of surveillance inquiry. So they made by making a transformation in the categorization of these communications, they redefine what they can accept. So this is quite technical, but it says the information about like a radio, what frequency it's broadcasting at, and who it's communicating with are not subject to the Fourth Amendment. Now that, when you come to the internet, and you can see where I'm going with this, is game-changing. Okay, I didn't watch my time. How much? 5 minutes, perfect. I won't talk more than that. One thing I want to say is I don't want you to think that people in Fort Meade were sitting around being conspiratorial and wanting to empower themselves. In fact, it's the opposite. They were freaked out They've been told that this kind of thing was going to, this was the kind of thing that almost made their agency abolished. But they nonetheless ran with it. And it became a massive expanding role. Now, all of this, as I said, is a prehistory of what happens in 9/11. So 9/11 is an inflection point, but it's a moment in which a lot of decisions are made very quickly. And those of you who lived through it, you might remember that the Patriot Act emerged within 3 weeks of 9/11. That didn't happen because a bunch of people got together and wrote it. It happened because a bunch of people had been advocating precisely for that kind of thing. And so the conversation about that was profoundly emaciated. So when I was thinking about Lauren's talk, some of you may remember there was something called, there was a kind of scary sounding surveillance effort that wasn't very much in the public eye. Now, I got 2,000 pages of Freedom of Information Act. A third of that is incredibly thoughtful arguments about the necessity of biosurveillance, but it's cast in a top secret vein. So precisely people like Lauren are not involved in the conversation. Civil society is not involved in the conversation. So too with so much of what happened in 9/11. Okay, so this metadata story is, of course, one that we know from Snowden and other kinds of things. And I'll just go through this very, very quickly. Essentially, in the 70s, there was a key court case that said there's no Fourth Amendment rights in the number you dial on your home phone that's on your wall. Phones used to be on the wall for some of you. But there is in this whatever you say on the phone. And tapping this, so you could put a tap on and collect people's phone, the numbers they're dialing through a subpoena without a warrant. Now, what happens after 9/11 is that this way of thinking gets transformed. This is from the Patriot Act. I'm sorry, my slides got all messed up in the translation. And they changed this technology, which was about brass wires, to the internet. And they say they're merely updating the technology. Now, the law did need to be updated, but anyone who says they're merely updating the law to go with tech is selling you a bag of goods, right? Anyone who says it's a natural sort of thing. And that's exactly what they said. Section 216 updated the law to the technology, right? Always an untrue sort of thing. Now, the last bit of this, and this gets into the sort of world of machine learning and other sorts of things, is that in this moment, you went from collecting the data, that's phone numbers dialed by one person or a few people in a criminal network, to collecting essentially all of the telephony and internet data on the entire US population, right? Now, this was clearly an issue. Was that legit? Well, I told you there's the secret court. The secret court, which is filled with really well-minded judges, many of whom are people to be respected, but they're not technologists, were sold a bill of goods. So the question comes up, is there a difference between collecting one person's telephone numbers, where we don't have a so-called reasonable expectation of privacy, and collecting everyone? And the court says, no, scale doesn't matter. There is ex nihilo. Okay, so what you get, so you want this metadata, why? Scale matters. Legally, scale doesn't matter. And I think this speaks directly to the conference. The levels of governance are talking about radically different things. So here we go. For legal purposes, you ignore scale. And for technical purposes, you celebrate scale. Now, I tell this story in the book, which my agent wants me to tell you is outside, about how data science itself emerges initially, the engineering attitude that we heard about, machine learning, emerges out of intelligence in extremely important ways, and is heavily funded by it. But they were the people who understood the kind of things that scale allows you to do with machine intelligence first. And you only had to read their histories to say so. So they described something that happens in the 1950s, the traffic analytic revolution. The whole point of the traffic analytic revolution is when you have scale, you know much more than you ever could. What other people would come to realize in the 90s and 2000s in machine learning, the NSA had made central to its mission by the early 1950s. And they say this: the fundamental importance of understanding not just the content of communication and the mean to hide those, but of the systems and technologies. That is exactly what is behind this constellation of buying data, because it is not legally protected, because there are no limits on the commercial collection of data in most sectors, and a sense that if the NSA is buying it from a third party, it doesn't matter. Now, what do we, just to conclude on this, there's a lot of things to come here, and exactly what to do is unclear. But the point is of how emaciated and problematic kind of governance we see here at the very highest levels. There are serious policy conversations we had, and they were systematically not had. In fact, those bodies that had been created out of a recognition that there were classified equities themselves were unable to have the very conversations they want. So we need, if we're going to confront the sort of problems that, say, that Lauren identifies, or the community level problems that Lydia, or that we're going to hear from Sergio, we cannot have the conversation this way, even at the elite levels of government. And that is true as much as concerns about privacy that we civil libertarians have. But also, if the United States government is so excited to buy this data because it's important to national security, why on earth are we selling it? Why is it not a national security issue, the privacy? Because we know what machine learning can and can't do. Okay, sorry for going over, but thank you.
Wow, those may have been dry, boring government text slides, but you turned it into rather a terrifying narrative. I'd say bravo, but I have to still recover from that. Okay, the last presentation of the panel before we go into questions is from Sergio Beltran Garcia, who is an architect, activist, and researcher. I've had several conversations with him over the past 2 days. Each one has been fascinating and sometimes challenging, and I suspect that's what we will hear today. He specializes in mobilizing memory for human rights causes. He's the holder of a master's from Goldsmiths. He researched state and corporate violence at forensic architecture, and as an adjunct professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, he co-directs Representare, a forensic architecture unit within the investigative commons. So I look forward to this, and Sergio, please take it away.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to express my gratitude to Rice University, to all of the organizers and staff of the conference, to my fellow panel members, and a special thanks to Rodrigo Ferreira, Dr. Rodrigo Ferreira, for allowing me to share today my work and interest around data, memory, and the politics of registry. So yesterday, through the perspectives of Michael, Shannon, Matthew, and Jeffrey, we were made aware of the consequences of American scientists and its tech industry. It may seem to be decided in small private enclaves in American soil, but they certainly do not operate only within US borders. And today I will speak about how surveillance capitalism perpetrates a different kind of violence in many parts of Mexico. And I do want to say that today I am presenting on behalf of the 94 families that I accompany, who are organized in the search collectives of Hasta Encontrarte, Solecito de Veracruz, Siguiendo Tus Pasos, Madres Unidas y Fuertes, and Una Nación Buscándote. They are all search collectives looking for their disappeared family members in Mexico. So this is a graph showing the yearly reports of disappeared persons in Mexico. As you can see, the registries have been gradually increasing. The source of this data is the National Registry for Disappeared and Missing Persons, or RNPDNO for its Spanish acronym. Apologies. According to the RNPDNO, as of the 29th of January 2024, there are 114,433 registries of disappeared persons in Mexico. That means that currently around 25 persons disappear each day in Mexico, roughly one every hour. This data is very frightening, but it says very little about who is being disappeared and why. This is a portrait of Rafael. Rafael was disappeared while making his way to the United States in 2012. He was trying to get here to support his family. And in the RNPDNO, there are 27,951 images of portraits and distinguishing marks of disappeared persons. Here's a visualization of just 0.01% of this image database. Now, these people aren't data points. They aren't simply registries. Statistics make no sense to Rafael's mother, Ana Ruth, who is still in El Salvador waiting for his son to come back home. So in Mexico, there aren't just 114,433 registries of disappeared persons. There's more than 114,433 people being actively searched for by their family members. And it is imperative to understand the difference between a person and their registry, as well as the politics and perils we fall into when we only focus on data observations, and registries. To the families in Mexico who search for their disappeared, their loved ones are not registries, they are their tesoros, their treasures to be found. And this is the main argument I will be sharing with you today, how the overemphasis on data science, and statistics has become a tool to obscure the very human texture of violence, which fundamentally rests on memory. Data can be abused to depoliticize human suffering, and it can conceal memory. And I will show you how this is occurring in Mexico with the disappearance crisis. So the rest of this presentation is divided into two sections. First, I will contextualize how political and data architectures conceal the memory of the disappeared, which is a form of inverted surveillance whereby the Mexican state holds the monopoly of not only deciding who is a legitimately disappeared person, but also if they can access their rights to being searched for. And then I'll show you how searching families respond to this concealment through a project we call El Bosque de la Esperanza, or the Forest of Hope, which aims to restitute means of production of memory back to the families of the disappeared. And let's talk about the data and the RNPDNO first and how it conceals memory. Now, the Mexican Constitution has laws to respond to the disappearance crisis. In the general law for the matter of enforced disappearance, there's a chapter with 9 laws that make the RNPDNO the constitutional, legal, and scientific way to count Mexico's disappeared. That's what gives us this number. Now, this is the public website from which we can all source this data. By law, this registry must be kept in real time and must keep a total number of the disappeared, the missing people, and the found people. If you subtract the registries of found persons from the total, you get the number of registries of disappeared persons, 114,433. Its methodology is more or less as follows. First, when a disappearance occurs or is suspected, it should be reported to authorities. And this is the first and most important source of data outliers, and I'll come back to it in a moment. Second, each of the competent authorities in the 33 states in Mexico are mandated to send those registries to the RNPDNO. Now, there are around 700 officials who have the ability to access and upload data to this platform. And only the authorities who are investigating each individual case have the capacity to change the status of a registry, let's say from disappeared to found, but they can never be deleted. Now, third, big data processing algorithms detect potential duplicates by cross-referencing several databases. If a duplicate is flagged, human authorities are notified, which must revise and either validate the duplication or maintain the registry separated. Again, the registries cannot be deleted. Their statuses can only be changed, at least by law. And fourth, this data is uploaded to the RNPDNO platform. Now, searching kin in Mexico distrust the RNPDNO for 3 main reasons. First, authorities in Mexico, like police, military, and even elected officials, they perpetrate enforced disappearance. They plan and execute the disappearance of persons for political or other reasons. So out of fear of reprisal from those authorities who maintain political or security power, families sometimes do not report the disappearance of their family members. Second, the algorithm's code is not public and therefore remains an inscrutable black box. And third, the duplicate validation process is opaque and almost impossible to challenge. So this is how the RNPDNO becomes this inverted surveillance tool that monopolizes the recognition of who is disappeared and a person worthy of being searched for and who is not. And because not all disappearances are reported because families mistrust authorities, a huge dark figure exists. And victims estimate that this could mean that the real number of disappeared could be twice as much or higher than 114,000. But regardless, we will hold on to this number because it is official data obtained from constitutionally mandated methodologies that are executed through state-sponsored science. Now, I want to offer the second piece of data. The Mexican government has publicly admitted to a bursting forensic crisis where more than 52,000 bodies are in the country remain unidentified in morgues and mass graves. These numbers are based on citizen reports which are collected by search collectives who are searching for their disappeared treasures. They collected this data from Freedom of Information requests from states' prosecutors' offices. Searching Families in Mexico pays special attention to these numbers because it is quite likely that a large number of disappeared persons stay lost for years unidentified in morgues and mass graves. And many families who search in Mexico perform this same speculation. And I'm sorry that you almost can't see the red text, but if we subtract the unidentified bodies from the total number of the disappeared, there's a possibility that close to half of the disappeared could be identified if only forensic capabilities could perform such identifications. Now, the RNPDNO shows that the total number of disappeared in this presidency has exceeded that of the previous two presidencies. And the current president of Mexico has decided that this statistic is a political and electoral threat. This year is an election year in Mexico. In a few months, we will be electing our new president. So in the summer of 2023, the president publicly questioned the numbers of the RNPDNO and judged it untrustworthy. He announced his government would perform a new census with an unknown methodology, and the process took less than 4 months to be executed. And this is a third data source. The census has no legal basis whatsoever, and its scientific veracity is questionable, to say the least, but it does carry its own political power. And the survey concluded there are only 12,377 confirmed registries of disappeared persons. The survey also created new categories of disappeared which are not recognized in law, such as the elusive located category, which means that although no proof of life or death exists, there is a documental trace, which an authority found, of, say, a person having received the COVID vaccination, which proves that that person still is locatable. Obviously, families who are finding their disappeared family members under this new category are under extreme renewed emotional stress because they are located, but they are not alive or dead and nowhere to be found. So the results of this census also account for 11% of the total amount of the RNPDNO and 10% of the disappearances that have occurred in the presidency that is right now still in power. Overnight, 9 out of every 10 registries were disappeared. And this is why in Mexico we say that a person disappears 3 times. First, when the person themselves is disappeared. Second, when the evidence of the crime is disappeared. And third, when the memory of the person who is disappeared disappears. 12,377 is also merely a quarter of the number of unidentified bodies in Mexico. Just try to, make a logical argument for that within your brains. I challenge you to come up with a logical answer to how that is possible. And this is a lesson in how we must understand that a registry is merely an official record. It is not the person themselves. So though the RNPDNO may have the legitimacy of being lawful, methodological, and scientific, it is, however, still a state surveillance method that is mistrusted by searching families. And families are not interested in counting, but in narrating who the person is for. They don't care about censuses. They don't care about registries. They want to tell who their person are because they believe that if they do so, the will of the public will be moved enough to mobilize political actions that will warrant effective search actions. And that's why they refuse to call them registries. They are treasures to be found. So it is affect that mobilizes families and Mexican society to demand governments and institutions to respond to this crisis. Instead of overemphasizing the empirical and material registries, we turn to the non-representational affects of families to represent or bring back to presence those which are not present, that disappeared. And this is what El Bosque La Esperanza seeks to amplify. So before I continue, I'd like for the searching families to introduce El Bosque.
Busco a mi hijo.
Yo busco a mi papá.
Yo busco a mi hija.
Y yo busco a mi hijo.
Yo busco a mi hermano.
Tengo un hijo desaparecido desde hace 17 años.
Para mí es muy importante esta plataforma para concientizar a más personas de la situación que vivimos aquí. Ponerla en un memorial para que la gente la visualice más.
Memoria es hablar sobre mi papá, es hacer esto, es buscar cualquier espacio para seguir hablando de él.
Estamos aquí tratando de que este proyecto se haga realidad porque consideramos que sería efectivo para hacer más amplio la información sobre nuestras desapariciones.
Como dignificando su identidad o su existencia.
Es un proyecto importantísimo, nos muestra mucha esperanza y fortaleza para seguir adelante. También nos va a ayudar a tener mucha difusión y que la gente y el mismo gobierno se concientice en el problema que estamos viviendo. Que realmente pueda estar en la memoria de todos, como en la de nosotros. Y queremos lograr que la dignidad se haga costumbre.
So, El Bosque de la Esperanza is a project that draws lessons from human rights studies because I am a firm believer that memory needs to work with other aspects, not just design, or we need to work with other fields, such as human rights. And there's a report by the UN in summer of 2020 where they name memory the fifth pillar of transitional justice, which means that it must rest on the other four pillars. It is a transversal pillar. And this is why I often say that memory without truth is a lie, that memory without justice is impunity, memory without reparation is damage, and memory without guarantees of non-repetition is oblivion. I think you might all think about memory practices that fail to do these things and do not repair damage back to the communities which suffer violence. Yet we have national holidays, monuments, memorials, etc. And it's no wonder that we find ourselves still trapped in these spirals of violence years, months, or decades later. Now, in Mexico, faced with these deficient access to, victims who cannot access their rights, they start using memory as a way to fight back. And in the case of enforced disappearance, there has been a practice that's been taken spontaneously by many collectives, which they name the trees of hope. They take trees in public space and name them so. The first one was taken on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victim of Enforced Disappearance in 2015 by the collective Fuerzas Unidas por Nuestros Desaparecidos en Coahuila. And by the end of 2023, I was able to document the existence of almost 30 of these trees of hope. Now, not all of them still exist because governments often remove them. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in El Bosque, we have 5 different collectives with 94 families, and we're all working together with a small team of coordinators with Aline Wani and Maevia Griffiths of the Swiss NGO VIFT, and together we're weaving this collective forest of memory and of hope. And this is why we've held workshops to be able to collectively design this project. We aim to strike a balance between intimacy and privacy of searching kin's memory and its mediation in public. And this is the most challenging and risky part of the project, as the danger of memory appropriation and dispossession by either governments, academia, or other private actors, such as myself, is a documented threat. It is crucial to reduce these risks and maximize trust in the families, but also the legitimacy of this socio-technical practice of memory in order for its representation to be an effective resistance to the bureaucratic procedures that erase and stigmatize the disappeared through data and statistics. So we do this by prioritizing victims' needs and moving at the speed of trust. We set out achievable expectations, and we move away from numerical counts and get closer to their treasures by listening to what the families want to mediate back to the public. And we listen that they want to share what are the songs their family, their treasures enjoyed, the names of their pets, their dreams and talents, how they laughed, what their principles were. And El Bosque does this through 2 components. One is a physical retroreflective ribbon that is laser engraved with the names and faces of the disappeared, which are meant to be hung on the trees of hope. And then through a QR code, these are linked to a virtual component, which is a WhatsApp chatbot where families can upload their memories to a digital and collaborative platform. Now, anyone can use a piece of cheap cloth and hang it on a tree and call it a ribbon. We don't aim to make an official ribbon, but we do aim to offer a ribbon that distinguishes the trees and that has a portrait that does not fade with the weather. And these are the ribbons we fabricate and give to the families who search for their disappeared. We make them very, very accessible at very low cost because we gift them to the families. We never charge a single peso to them. We travel to the cities to deliver these ribbons personally. We give them a plaque so they can place it on the trees and distinguish the trees themselves, and we perform rituals together to name the trees of hope. And amazing things are said by the families in these rituals. Some of them say that they know that through the trees, its roots, and the soil, in another part of the country or the world, their family member is connected to that tree. So being there is, in a sense, a way of being in the presence of those who are disappeared. And they form very strong bonds with the trees. These trees sometimes become public spaces for other struggles, which I find very, very important. They hang these ribbons on trees, and the ribbons are personalized by embroidered messages or written down messages. And we also add bells to the ribbons so they can have sound to call the attention of passerby. This one is in Veracruz. You can see it's a bit more tropical there. So, the trees thus become a way for search collectives to communicate who their disappeared are directly to their communities without the mediation of technology, governments, or platforms susceptible to surveillance of data. This is an completely offline method, but we do want to communicate to wider audiences, which is why we have virtual components. I'm going to start with the web platform. This is a picture of some of the workshops we did to design the UX of the platform. And based on the findings of these workshops, we developed a prototype which, through the guiding concept of a forest, solves aesthetic and political needs of the families. This concept creates 3 different spaces in the forest. One are the branches themselves, which is the most visible part, where the disappeared feature and their stories. But we also make visible what the roots are, what keeps the trees healthy. And that's the work of the search collectives and the family members. Every action they do to keep the memory of their family members alive. It is important. Often when a person disappears, their families also disappear. They become empty signifiers. So it's important to also visibilize who the families are. And then we have the mycelium, which is where the networks that keep healthy the forest and connect the trees are alive. That's people like me, for example. This is a live prototype that we hope to make publicly available in summer of this year. And we tested this prototype and its navigation to ensure that it would be intuitive and accessible as possible, because the demographics of the people who are part of the search collectives are overwhelmingly women. Most of them are over 50 years old and are very intimidated by technology. So we had to figure out how to make this accessible, and we found through some surveys that WhatsApp is overwhelmingly the application they are most familiar with, which is why we decided to have a WhatsApp chatbot be the input device or the interface between the memories of the families and their platform. And the chatbot is only accessible to the families who are in the project. Only their phones are able to enter this chatbot. And they upload images, videos, voice notes, and web links to create a collective archive that brings back the human texture that numbers and statistics will never be able to hold. So this month, we begin to release this chatbot to the 94 families that collectively narrate 101 disappeared persons, and we're already fabricating the next 350 ribbons. By the end of this year, we will be taking care of almost 400 families. But again, it's important to say as a closing note that we are not attempting to achieve numbers and statistics. This is actually something that we've learned in the process. We thought that we were going to be inviting more collectives, and now we're more of the idea that we will probably not grow. Because it is so important to stay in touch and accompany these families, we don't want to create statistics. This was thought as a scalable project, but we realized that memory, it's just not compatible with those ways of thinking. And we cannot abandon the emerging context that happened to them. 2 weeks ago, a couple of them were threatened, and we need to stop everything and just focus collectively on what's going on, make sure that they're safe. So anyways, I hope this presentation helped explain how socio-technical practices of disappearance victims are embraced by this memory project. That I hope it was clear that the overall aim is to allow the memory of the disappeared to become legitimate representation in public to counter official data narratives and official narratives, if only to flicker ever more intensely until it is accepted widely as collective and public truth. And I want to finish with something that the families say, and they insist in every single time they make themselves public: ¿Por qué los buscamos? Porque los amamos. Which means, why do we search for them? Because we love them. Thank you.